Hello, and welcome to The Monster and the Child, where childhood studies and monster studies collide. I am Dr. Kathleen Kellett, and this video is The Monsters of Adultism. We are going to explore how we can understand children as a marginalized demographic in our society, some of the attitudes that contribute to this marginalization, and of course, the monster stories that can illuminate these aspects of our culture. So let's dive right in. One of the monsters that we most associate with childhood is the boogeyman. The boogeyman is less a singular monster than a broad monster type. The Dictionary of English Folklore by Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Roald defines it as, quote, any figure deliberately used to frighten others, almost always children, to control their behavior, end quote. Bogies or boogeymen, or bugbears or other variations, could be fairies, ghosts, demons, even, quote, the local doctor or policeman, end quote, when used as a threatening figure to keep kids in line. Simpson and Roald note that the most common threats associated with this type of monster are kidnapping and cannibalism. Boogeymen are not just confined to English folklore. Wikipedia's entry on this monster has a very fun list of cultural variations. The link is in the description with the work cited, and if you're in the mood for a Wikipedia black hole, this is a good place to start. Standouts include El Coco for the Spanish-speaking world, who eats children if they refuse to go to sleep, so pity the tiny insomniacs. Belize has a goblin called Tata Duende, whose forest-dwelling presence is used to keep children from straying into the wilderness or going out late at night. We can find a similar function of controlling children's space in Sicily's Marabecca, a water monster that snatches children playing too close to wells or reservoirs. Incidentally, when looking for images for this video, I couldn't find any published artwork of the Marabecca, but her fan art represents the essential shape-shifting nature of boogeyman-type monsters, as I saw depictions ranging from a beautiful witch or a hag to giant frogs to fully Lovecraftian eldritch horrors. Not quite as amorphous, but just as culturally malleable is the Sackman subtype of the boogeyman, which is straight up just a guy who stuffs misbehaving children into a bag and carries them away. You can find variations of this dude in places as far from each other as Eastern Europe, South Africa, and Vietnam. This is just a small sampling of the time-honored, multicultural tradition of scaring the crap out of kids until they do what adults want. Kara Shimabukuro writes, quote, folkloric figures do not completely change through time. They simply become reimagined, providing us a lens through which to view our own world, end quote. Boogeymen, as sort of the ultimate overlap between the monster and the child, provide us with a lens through which we can start to understand prevailing attitudes about children and childhood. In some of these stories, we can find some real adult fears. Jungles and reservoirs are, in fact, dangerous to children. Families who live near them will understandably do what they need to do to keep their kids from getting lost or drowning or coming to other grievous bodily harm. Is instilling a fear of cannibalism or kidnapping the most psychologically healthy way of doing that? Perhaps not, but at least the kids will be alive to work that out in therapy later. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen tells us that monsters, quote, police the borders of the possible, end quote. This function of monstrosity can sometimes be quite literal when it comes to geography. There are many types of monsters whose purpose is to delineate where people should and should not go. Think of the Here Be Monsters portions of old maps, where sea monsters inhabit the dangerous, often unnavigable waters. As long as you don't go where the monsters are, the forest, the well, the ocean, you can remain safe. But not all boogeymen safeguard children's physical well-being. Plenty of those other examples focus primarily on children's behavior, going to bed when they're told, not acting spoiled, obeying the adults in their lives. Now, here's where we can start to unpack common attitudes and beliefs about childhood, and how those beliefs may impact real children. Childhood is both a biological and a social category. As I discussed a bit in my last video, link to that in the description below, there are a few things that we can claim about childhood that are broadly true regardless of culture. Babies are born small and without a lot of cognitive and motor skills. In most, but not all cases, these skills will develop throughout the life course, with a period of time we call childhood, representing the most outwardly obvious period of rapid growth and learning. Babies require a lot of adult care to stay alive long enough for these changes to happen, and then even when children are walking and talking, they continue to learn about the world from the older people in their lives. If that all seems obvious and broad, that's because I can't get much more specific than that without leaving the realm of biology and heading straight into culture. Even everything I already mentioned, whether it may be true the world over, is not all understood the same way. The ways in which cultures make sense of, make meaning out of, this early part of the human life course is what we can refer to as the social constructions of childhood. These are the ideas and ideologies about childhood that may be derived from the interpretation of biological facts, but are not themselves universal or natural truths. Instead, they're cultural principles, values, and philosophies that organize the ways childhood functions within a society. Take, for example, education. Biologically, most people rapidly learn a lot throughout childhood, but what should that learning look like? K through 12 schools, trade apprenticeships, multi-age community schooling, homeschooling? Where should children live while they're being educated? With families or with the educators? Or are those one and the same? What should they learn? Reading, writing, arithmetic? Farm management skills? What about moral values? How and by whom should those be instilled? What institutions and laws should exist to ensure that children get the education that, collectively, a society has decided that they need? Learning may be biological, but education is socially constructed. Crucially, socially constructed does not mean not real. Children's entire realities are frequently shaped around social constructions of education, which determine where they physically are, who they're with, and of course what they know, or at least what they're supposed to know. Also, I'm an educator. I obviously have strong opinions about what constitutes a good education, and I believe even more strongly that education should be broadly accessible. Education is incredibly real. It's just derived from human cultures, and as such, ideas about it are not universal. That's what social constructions are all about. So let's bring this back to the boogeyman. What do various cultures' propensity to scare children into good behavior tell us about those cultures' social constructions of childhood? There's clearly a hierarchy at play here, in which adult desires, management of time, and social values are seen as more important and more right than children's. So much so that the maintenance of these desires, values, etc. can be outsourced to monsters. In my first video essay, and another link to that below, I provide a definition of monstrosity as the antagonistic opposite of humanity. So children's conformity to what adults want them to do is so crucial that breaking those rules literally calls in the anti-human to respond to it. To be properly human, to not invite the encroachment and danger of monstrosity, children must be the way adults want them to be. I imagine that this reading of the boogeyman may provoke a little bit of defensiveness in some adult viewers of this video. Hold on, some of you might be saying. Children do have to defer to adults. That's what keeps them safe. That's how they learn right from wrong. If those thoughts may have crossed your mind, I invite you to really sift through how much of that belief is based in the biological and how much is based on your own social constructions of childhood. That's not something a lot of people do, by the way. We tend to take our social constructions very much for granted. So interrogating your own puts you a step ahead in terms of critical thinking, and I hope we can all agree that that's something the world needs a lot of right now. The truth is, there are a lot of contradictions baked into our social constructions of childhood. On the one hand, in modern Western culture, we are very attached to the idea of childhood as a time of innocence. I know I keep kind of teasing this idea, and rest assured in my next video, I'm going to be starting a whole series on what this concept is really all about. But if children are so naturally innocent, why do we need things like the boogeyman to keep them in line? Well, part of the answer is that the boogeyman definitely predates our modern construction of childhood innocence, But their continued coexistence with this competing ideology is something that I think demonstrates how narrow our ideas about innocence can really be. Children are innocent as long as they go where they're supposed to go, do what they're supposed to do, and say what they're supposed to say. Basically, as long as they don't annoy adults too much. As long as adulthood remains in charge. So with that, let's get into the concept of adultism. Adultism, according to scholar and children's rights activist John Wall, is, quote, the historically normative marginalization of children by age, end quote. Full disclosure, John Wall is a professor at Rutgers University Camden's Department of Childhood Studies, where I got my PhD, so shout out to my old department. We can understand adultism in similar terms as we do other systemic forms of marginalization and minoritization. These attitudes are baked into our social structures and institutions, such as schools or laws. Wall writes that, quote, children are understood as lesser human beings, less rational, less developed, less competent, and less valued as citizens. Adultism, so understood, represents a side of paternalism, where the pater, or father, is recognized not only as gendered, but also aged, end quote. Again, this statement may induce a little defensiveness in some adults. We may balk at less valued. Surely children are the most valuable, the most precious. But less developed, less competent? Isn't that at least a little biological and therefore factual? Well, where does that belief lead us? Wall argues nowhere good. Quote, children's mistreatment, for example, their being subject to physical punishment, being banned from public spaces, and lack of real voices in schools, is underwritten by the cultural acceptance of an inbuilt adult-child hierarchy, end quote. There's a difference between recognizing the range of, for example, cognitive functions among children and adults, which are not nearly as distinct and delineated as we sometimes think they are, by the way, versus translating difference into deficit. In other words, adultism functions by defining children as not just different from adults, but as less than adults. Less what? Less fully human. Not finished actually turning into real people, and therefore less deserving of the autonomy that we otherwise consider part and parcel of human rights. Now, in some ways, we do have a cultural awareness of adultism as a potential problem, at least when it goes too far, even for adults at the top of that hierarchy. And, as we often do, we explore those limits of acceptable human behavior with monster stories, such as Roald Dahl's Matilda. Okay, so here's where you learn that I do tend to cast a wide net with what I consider a monster story. It's true, Matilda doesn't have any actual, literal, non-human characters. In fact, the only supernatural person is Matilda herself, as she uses her telekinetic powers to navigate her brutally adultist environment. But I think we can pretty comfortably classify the Trunchbull as a monster in terms of narrative function. But first, let's back up. For anyone who is either unfamiliar with Matilda or has not read or watched its excellent film adaptation for a long time, a refresher. Matilda is a kindergartner with the odds stacked against her. She is the unwanted daughter of a family of lazy grifters, the Wormwoods. Her father is a crooked used car salesman, and her mother is as materialistic as she is negligent. This being a Roald Dahl story, these characters are painted in very broad, often grotesque strokes. The exaggeration of their negative traits edges Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood into a monstrous category as well, as their neglect and abuse of their daughter definitely break the rules of human society, even an adultist one. This is especially true in the film adaptation, where the opening scene shows the Wormwoods letting the newborn Matilda slide all around the trunk of their car as they recklessly drive home from the hospital, complaining the whole time about the cost and inconvenience of having her. But even the Wormwoods have nothing on Miss Trunchbull. Miss Trunchbull is the headmistress of Matilda's school. Dahl describes her thus, quote, she was above all a most formidable woman. She had once been a famous athlete, and even now the muscles were still clearly in evidence. You could see them in the bull neck, in the big shoulders, in the thick arms, in the sinewy wrists, and in the powerful legs. Looking at her, you got the feeling that this was someone who could bend iron bars and tear telephone directories in half, end quote. So there's a lot going on here. Despite the potential benefits of how Matilda illuminates systems of adultism, Roald Dahl was, let's say, not a perfect person. In creating his monstrous Trunchbull, he reveals some of his own gender biases. When called upon to portray a cruel, anti-human figure who breaks the most fundamental rules of human society, he defaults to a masculine woman. Bummer. The Trunchbull is a good example of how monsters or monstrous characters often reveal a lot of cultural assumptions and ideologies, even when those assumptions aren't necessarily the point of the story. Because the main purpose of the Trunchbull as a character is to demonstrate the outsized power that adults have over children, how adults justify that power to themselves, and the fundamental injustice that this power differential generates. Again, the film adaptation makes this particularly clear, giving the Trunchbull the following dialogue. Quote, "I have never been able to understand why small children are so disgusting. They're the bane of my life. They're like insects. They should be got rid of as early as possible," end quote. The Trunchbull puts this disgust into action by doing things like throwing little girls over the fence by their pigtails, forcing Bruce Bogtrotter to eat an entire cake by himself, and of course, locking children in the chokey, which is a narrow cupboard lined with spikes into which the Trunchbull shoves misbehaving kids. In a way, the Trunchbull is a boogeyman. Her monstrous behavior is, in theory, a response to children's disobedience. Bruce stole a piece of her cake. Even Amanda Thripp, the pigtails girl, wasn't technically supposed to have pigtails based on the Trunchbull's own rules. And who better to set the rules than the adult headmistress? But Matilda provides a child-centric take on the boogeyman, in which the monstrous punishments are clearly unjustified by whatever small infractions the adults imagine the children have committed. Yet, even though the children know that the Trunchbull is cruel and unfair, they are powerless to stop her. Matilda herself points out that no parent would believe the tales of the Trunchbull's outrageousness, even parents who actually care about their children, unlike Matilda's. Not only is the Trunchbull too over the top, but children are too often seen as inherently unreliable narrators. In one of the most iconic scenes of the film adaptation, Mr. Wormwood berates his daughter with the following words. Quote, "I'm smart, you're dumb. I'm big, you're little. I'm right, you're wrong, and there's nothing you can do about it," end quote. Later, the Trunchbull repeats him verbatim. Of course, Matilda can actually do something about it. Her quick thinking and telekinesis save the day. But while there are definitely a lot of quick thinking children in the world, there unfortunately are not any telekinetic ones. Matilda's power is the only overtly fantastical part of the narrative. And in an adultist society, children's power often is just that, a fantasy. Even those adults who try to act on behalf of the well-being of children often still reinforce their marginalization, simply because it is so deeply ingrained in our society. Annette Ruth Appel writes about the limitations of child-centered jurisprudence in legal proceedings. Even lawyers and judges attempting to create positive outcomes for young people are hampered by the legal definition of children, of minors, as dependents. Appel writes, quote, "The legal construction of children in the United States as dependent, and of dependency as private, familial, and developmental, obscures both the contingency of childhood and the law's role in creating and maintaining childhood," end quote. Legally, an adult has to be in charge of a child's decision-making and physical whereabouts at all times. That adult inherently has more legal rights than the child. Those rights can be stripped if the legal system decides that the adult, generally a parent, is abusing those rights, but that still requires the child to be transferred as a dependent over to another adult. It's adult decision-making all the way down. Indeed, we see how Matilda's well-being depends on her ability to navigate and change her own legal status while still remaining a dependent minor. She can't leave school, but she can torment the Trunchbull into leaving instead. She needs a legal guardian, but at least she is able to convince the Wormwoods to relinquish their parental rights and sign her over to Miss Honey. The ease of this transaction is almost as fantastical as Matilda's telekinesis. But even in this heightened, unrealistic narrative, we have this acknowledgement that Matilda, as a child, has fewer rights than whoever is legally in charge of her. Appel writes that within the legal system, quote, child-centered jurisprudence equates progress with the transition of children from property to persons, but sheds little light on what personhood means for children outside of their dependent status. In other words, the personhood of the child of child-centered jurisprudence exists only within the boundaries of dependency vis-a-vis parent, state, and school, end quote. Matilda is not able to change these boundaries. The extent of her power is simply to finagle herself into better guardians. And with that, we see one of the potential limitations of illustrating big systemic issues like adultism through monster stories. I know, perhaps a surprising thing for me to say here on The Monster and the Child, but remember one of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's main tenets of metaphor from their landmark Metaphors We Live By. Metaphors, such as monsters, reveal certain aspects of a concept, but they also conceal other aspects. The Trunchbull reveals the adultist power hierarchy under which children are seen as less than and are therefore afforded fewer rights than adults. However, by depicting this system through a single larger-than-life exaggerated monster character, we can lose some of the broader implications. Matilda is able to vastly improve her own life, but the adultist system that created the conditions of her suffering in the first place still remains. There are, of course, some narratives that do try to unpack a broader systemic understanding of oppression. Some of them also do this with monsters. One very famous example is Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games. Not to over-explain a cultural juggernaut, but the Hunger Games trilogy, along with its prequels, A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and Sunrise on the Reaping, explored the dystopian world of Panem. Panem is, geographically, the remains of the United States in a very bleak future. The capital, the seat of Panem's government, rules in absolute power over the 12 to 13 districts, which exist in varying levels of economic depression. Of course, the districts did not settle into their states of oppression willingly. The Hunger Games themselves are a testament to the district's first failed revolution. Every year, on the anniversary of the district's defeat, 2 youths, ages 12 to 18, are chosen from each district to compete in a televised fight to the death. In the epilogue of A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, we get some insight into the origins of the games. The philosophy supports a dark view of human nature, especially in the use of children. Quote, because we credit them with innocence. And if even the most innocent among us turn to killers in the Hunger Games, what does that say? That our essential nature is violent, end quote. The games use this object lesson in humanity's brutality to enshrine the use of that brutality within the seat of dictatorial authority, while reminding would-be rebels that their own violence will only lead to their suffering. We all may be violent, but we are not all powerful. So, the use of children is doing double duty here. Not only does their involvement in the games defile innocence and create disillusionment in the populace, but it also symbolizes the district's powerlessness. After all, in an adultist society, who is more powerless than a child? Adultism is not the only thing that endangers the children of Panem, or at least not adultism functioning by itself. No system of oppression operates in isolation. All children may face certain restrictions to their rights on account of their age, as John Wall points out. Quote, children face this broader discriminatory form of adultism across their lives, such as in lacking democratic voices, being denied standing in court, and not being provided with required asylum proceedings, end quote. But even within that statement, we can see that some children will face more of adultism's material impacts to their well-being than others. For instance, when I was a child, I never needed asylum proceedings. That was an aspect of adultism that did not affect me due to my additional conditions of nationality, family and financial security, race, etc. Suzanne Collins portrays the overlap of adultism with other systems of oppression, quite literally in the first chapter of the first book. Our narrator Katniss, age 16, explains how young people's names are entered into the lottery for the games. When you're 12, you get entered once. The next year, your name goes in again, so you have 2 chances of being drawn, and so on until you're 18. But, as Katniss tells us, it's not actually that simple. Quote, "Say you were poor and starving as we were. You can opt to add your name more times in exchange for tesserae. Each tessera is worth a meager year's supply of grain and oil for one person. You may do this for each of your family members as well. So at the age of 12, I had my name entered 4 times. Once because I had to, and 3 times for tesserae for grain and oil for myself, Prim, and my mother." End quote. All children in Panem have fewer rights than even the incredibly disenfranchised adults. I mean, at least the adults don't have to fight to the death anymore. But children in poverty experience the impact of those loss of their rights to a greater extent. Adultism and classism intersect, and the workings of these systems in tandem keep the machine of the capital chugging along. Suzanne Collins employs monsters to illustrate this world of adultism as an ism among isms. We have some very literal monsters, such as the mutations that the capital genetically engineers to torment the Hunger Games contestants. Examples include trackerjackers, aggressive hallucination-inducing wasps that have literally given me nightmares. Even more horrifying are the wolf mutts that pursue the last remaining contestants in the first book. These hybrid creatures represent each of the fallen tributes and appear to have been made using the dead children's actual eyeballs. This is about as monstrous as it gets, with a combination of not only animal and human, but also living and dead. The innocent children have been reduced to literal beasts, no longer human at all, the ultimate threat and promise of the Hunger Games. Yet even these creatures pale in comparison to President Coriolanus Snow. General shout out to Suzanne Collins here. Having your villain's breath smell like roses and blood is just such a rad character design choice. It's just really good. It's really unsettling. I'm obsessed with it, especially in Mockingjay, spoilers, when Snow laughs at his execution with blood dripping from his mouth. Exquisite. Like, I know, hot take, mega best-selling phenomenon, The Hunger Games, is good actually, but we simply have to give credit where credit is due. Anyway, Snow, like the Trunchbull, is not literally non-human, but he is certainly inhuman enough to qualify as a monster. He functions as that antagonistic opposite to the qualities of humanity that the protagonists are fighting for. He is the old, white-bearded face of adultist oppression and the pristine, rich figure who stands above the oppressed poor. Katniss, as a poor child, is his natural enemy, and he is hers. While Snow may be the monstrous symbol of the system, however, he is not its entirety. In Matilda, defeating the Trunchbull solves all of the problems of the children in the school, but defeating Snow does not solve all of Panem's problems. That's one of the major points of the entire 3rd book, Mockingjay, as Katniss contends with the power, hunger, and manipulations of the revolution's leaders. The triumphant new president, Alma Coin, even wants to reinstate the Hunger Games, only this time using the children of the capital as contestants. The actual leadership of the government might be changing, but that adultist system is harder to dismantle, especially because of the underlying assumptions that what happens to children is the responsibility and right of adults to decide. Appel writes, quote, "A variety of adults have authority over children. These adults range from their parents to teachers, healthcare providers, and, for some children, lawyers. These adults, with varying levels of knowledge and authority over the specific child, have great power in a child's life, but little accountability to the child because of the child's lack of authority." End quote. Katniss, as a contestant in the Hunger Games, is at the mercy of the state. She is a symbol of the powerlessness of the people. Then, as the Mockingjay, the face of the revolution, Katniss remains a symbol, now of the powerless people rising up, but that doesn't actually make her more powerful. She is still a child, beholden to the decisions of adults, and these adults are not accountable to her. Until, because this is a fantasy narrative with a structure that demands some form of cathartic resolution, Katniss does have the opportunity to call one of the shots, very literally, pun definitely intended. She ushers in a new era for children, as demonstrated by her eventual willingness to have kids of her own in the trilogy's epilogue, since they are no longer at risk of violent death at the hands of the state. A big improvement, to be sure. But as is the purpose of dystopia as a genre, the reader is positioned to wonder about the implications of the story within their own world. In the absence of a bow and arrow, what can we do to start dismantling the monstrous workings of adultism? In Children's Rights, Today's Global Challenge, John Wall claims, quote, "Children's rights are the greatest remaining frontier in humanity's experiment in human rights as such," end quote. It's a big statement, and a challenging one for many adults. Honestly, it's a challenging statement for a lot of actual young people, too. They're as enmeshed in our cultural, social constructs as anyone else. And with childhood, again, we do run into issues of actual cognitive and physical needs for care. What Wall and scholars like him challenge us to consider is whether this care must be synonymous with the type of dependency that we have enshrined in our legal, familial, and educational systems today. Wall differentiates between philosophies of child saving and child empowerment. Child saving is, quote, "the assumption that children's rights exist primarily as a means for children to be taken care of by adults, to be protected from various kinds of violence and harm, and to be provided with various kinds of entitlements and resources," end quote. Good parents or teachers or actors of the state keep children safe from danger, either by physically determining where they can go or by impressing upon them the kinds of behaviors they need in order to stay safe, to not invite a visit from the boogeyman. Child empowerment, on the other hand, quote, "means that children's rights are founded on a deeper respect for children as equally important contributors to societies," end quote. Some stories, like Matilda and the Hunger Games, which are not coincidentally intended for young audiences, start to get at what it means to treat children as real contributors to society, instead of property or symbols. By portraying some of the workings of adultism through monstrous figures like the Trunchbull or President Snow, these narratives reveal the systems of power that are hidden and taken for granted in our own world. That's one of the things that monsters do best. They render the usually invisible grotesqueries of our lives all too obvious, whether through the horror of blood and roses or a buff lady. You win some, you lose some. Still, portraying children's lack of rights as a monstrous violation of humanity is one way that narratives can support children's empowerment. But how do we avoid that trap of child saving? That is something I am going to explore further in my upcoming series of videos about the construction of childhood innocence. You knew it was coming. There are a lot of great monsters and monster stories that can help us unpack this topic, and so I hope that I will see you back here in 2 weeks. I am planning on sticking to that upload schedule of every other Sunday, but to make it easy on yourself, make sure to ring the bell for notifications. I hope that you will also give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and go ahead and subscribe to the channel so that you never miss a monstery conversation. I would love to see your comments about adultism and monstrosity below. In what stories, fictional or otherwise, do you see these two concepts overlap? Let's keep that conversation going. And with that, I will take my leave for now. I can't wait to see you next time on The Monster and the Child for more monstrous food for thought.